This moth lives on the back of this guy. Welcome to part 1 of the Bug of the Week, where we go in each week and discover a new species of insect. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We do this every week. We've got a new bug to go through. We learn all kinds of crazy, cool stuff and talk with experts on the topic as well. So if you're new here, consider subscribing. This is Pyralidae, a family of Lepidoptera known as pyralid moths, snout moths, or grass moths. This family includes roughly 6,100 species, ranging from North, Central, and South America. This family includes 5 species, which have the honor to be fondly named the sloth moth. They're not called the sloth moth because they look like sloths, or they act like sloths, or they're as slow as sloths, but because they actually live on sloths. They call the back of a sloth home. A fun fact about sloths is that they're actually the only naturally green mammal. So, if a person dyes their chihuahua green, obviously it's a green mammal, but naturally green mammals, sloths are the only ones. So that's really interesting. So to begin to understand the sloth moth, we must first understand the sloths. So sloths are these very interesting mammals that they're kind of a small family. There are actually only 6 species of sloths, and all of them fall in within 2 categories: 3-toed sloths or 2-toed sloths, which differentiate between their number of toes on their front legs. There is the pygmy 3-toed sloth, the Maine sloth, the pale-throated sloth, the brown-throated sloth, the Linnaeus's 2-toed sloth, and Hoffman's 2-toed sloth. And they all look fairly similar, but they also have a lot of differences. Some of them are more gray, some of them are more brown. Some individuals, this isn't genetic in any way, but like I mentioned earlier, they are the only naturally occurring green mammal. So their hair turns a green color from natural processes. So that's really unique. Actually, a really fascinating thing is that the pygmy 3-toed sloth lives in the mangroves off the coast of Panama. They live in the mangrove forest. And if you don't know what mangrove forest is, it's essentially, mangrove trees are a kind of tree that can grow on water and over water. They have these roots that dig down into the water, and they anchor down into the floor of the water, right? And so these trees don't have any soil. There's no ground. There's just water under them, which is really fascinating. And these sloths, the pygmy 3-toed sloth, lives in these mangrove forests. And, sloths often fall or go down to take a poop, right? And the pygmy 3-toed sloth has to figure out a way to deal with this because there is no forest floor. It's just water, like I mentioned. So what they've figured out how to do is they actually have made the ability to swim. So these little sloths, and they're pygmy, so they're miniature sloths. They're small in sloth terms, right? And they have come up with the ability to swim in these mangrove forests. And they do this, fairly slowly because they are sloths. But, they're pretty interesting. They've figured out a way to swim. So seeing a swimming sloth is super weird. Side note, tarantulas that live there also figured out a way to swim. So tarantulas that live there swim also. So it's super weird to see a spider that swims. Anyway, that was a tangent. So sloths are super fascinating. They actually mostly eat fruit, but mostly leaves. They're much like koalas in the way that they have multiple stomachs. So sloths actually have a 4-chambered stomach, much like cows, to digest those thick, often poisonous leaves and brush that they feed on in the wild. And so part of the reason that they're called the sloth, and the reason that the sloth word and term came to be, is that they're slothful. A sloth sleeps on an average of 20 hours a day, so most of the day they're sleeping. And that's because they need to use that energy to digest their food, because it's very dense, oftentimes toxic, and that's why they have the 4-chambered stomach. And that's what they use to decompose that food, and that takes a lot of energy. That's why they sleep all the time. So they often hang there, sleep, and then wake up and eat more. Essentially, when they're awake, they're eating all day long. The really fun thing about sloths is that they're actually really good parents as well. So the mother will have one offspring. They only have one at a time. And that baby will hang on them until they're old enough to go out on their own. So they'll feed them. And if you find a wild mother, you will see its baby just hanging on its back while they're sleeping and cuddling. It's really cute. Another interesting fact about the sloth is that they have an entire ecosystem living on their backs. It's called a back biome. It lives in their fur, and this includes fungi, moss, insects, bacteria, and this guy. So this begs the question, why would this moth choose the slow, lazy sloth as its home? Well, the answer is actually fairly simple. Like all moths, the sloth moth is born as a caterpillar and metamorphosizes into an adult moth. A metamorphosis is when it transforms to a larva to an adult. It becomes from larva to pupa to adult. It metamorphosizes into an adult moth. Pillars of this moth are known as coprophagious, which means they feed on feces. Yeah, that's right. Sloths don't return to the forest floor for very many reasons, one of which is if they have fallen or they need to poop. About once a week, the sloth methodically makes its way down to the forest floor to relieve itself. Using its pointy, nubby tail, it digs a small hole and does its business in the hole. Immediately, the sloth moth jumps on the feces and lays their eggs in it, so the young larvae have an instant food source for when they hatch. Like I mentioned, they feed on feces, so. The moths then return immediately to the sloth. The sloth buries the poop all neatly, because they're actually very clean gentlemen, and the sloth begins its ascension once again into the canopy of the rainforest. Eventually, the eggs hatch, the caterpillars eat until they pupate, hatch as adults, find another sloth host, and start the whole process over again. And again, this is not the only animal that lives on the back of the sloth. The sloth has an extremely complicated and diverse ecosystem completely on its back. And the sloth moth only lives on a sloth. They're completely dependent on sloths, just like many other species of moss, fungi, all that kind of stuff. If you enjoyed this episode about learning about sloth moths and their crazy life cycle, then just consider subscribing, hit that like button so that this video can get out there for more people, and maybe head over to our website where we teach kids and adults about all this kind of weird bug stuff through courses, online courses, in-person classes, and all that kind of stuff. So with that, I'll see you all next week.